Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles, and I'm the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. We've got a lot to get to this morning, so let's get right into it. We're going to be in John's Gospel again. This time we're tackling chapter 11. This is one of my favorite chapters in not just John's Gospel, but really in the whole Bible. I love the interaction with Jesus' teaching in Luke chapter 16, but in a completely opaque way. I love that we finally meet Martha and Mary in John's Gospel. I love that Jesus is pushing forward more and more in his audacious claims about who he is, and there will also be some more I am statements in this chapter. I love that Jesus is continuing to rile up the authorities and that they are now more seriously working toward getting rid of him. We also see Jesus showing his humanity in this chapter in a way that he hasn't really done before. And yet, even while he's doing that, he's also showing his divinity. There's just a lot going on here, and although it is a long chapter and I feel serious trepidation about tackling the entire thing in just one shot, to break it up would be to confuse the text and to miss the point and to detract from the arc of the narrative that John is trying to construct. So, let's get started. There's no time now for us to recap from the last installment. If you're behind, then please just go to YouTube, find our channel. You can go to the John's Gospel series and watch all of them, and then you'll be caught up and ready to go. Let's begin with verses 1 through 4. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Okay, as usual, Jesus is kind of talking in riddles, or at least so his audience must think. It's actually quite straightforward what he has said. It's just not the way that we tend to conceptualize things. When he says, this illness does not lead to death, well, spoiler alert, Lazarus is going to die. And yet Jesus says it doesn't lead to death. Well, it's because he means it's not going to end up that way. And instead, it's going to serve to show the glory of God. But he ends up just confusing everybody, potentially including ourselves. Jesus' foreknowledge is on full display here. He has shown many times before, even in this very book, that he knows what's going to happen. And he's shown again that he has it here as well. But it's strange because he says it does not lead to death. And as I just mentioned, well, Lazarus is going to die. We should also note that there is an interesting flash forward here. So here we are in chapter 11, and he talks about this incident with Mary anointing the Lord with ointment and wiping his feet with her hair. And you might have been wondering, I don't remember that happening if this is the first time you've been through John's Gospel. Well, that's because it hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen in the next chapter. And yet, John is assuming that his audience already knows that. Remember that he's not trying to write this book to a bunch of people who have never heard of Jesus. He's trying to write to people who do know Jesus to some extent. It has the effect of getting us to think about Jesus and his upcoming death and everything that will lead to that occurring. It also demonstrates the strong relationship and the care and concern between Jesus and really this whole family, not just Mary. Let's keep reading, start in verse 5. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this he said to the disciples, Let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. After saying these things, he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. Now, verse 5, where we began here, is almost adversative, which is to say it kind of stands at odds with what is going to follow. He says that Jesus loves this family, and yet he's going to sit and wait for Lazarus to die. Why does John even bother to bring that up? Well, it's to make sure that we know Jesus does care, that he's not just blowing them off. This is instead a very calculated decision on the part of Jesus. Now, when he says it is time for us to go over to Bethany, his disciples resist him. And what are the grounds for that again? They say in verse 8, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?" So they're surprised that Jesus wants to go so close to Jerusalem, because Bethany is only a couple of miles away from that. And Jesus' response to this is another riddle. Are there not 12 hours in the day? And you imagine the disciples going, I think there are, but I don't know what that has to do with the point at hand. Well, what he's trying to get at is walking in light, walking in darkness, and the choice that we have to make between the two. He made that same point, by the way, back in chapter 9, verse 4, if you want to go compare to the metaphor that he used there. But what he's trying to say is we've only got a certain amount of time, and the night is coming. And now is the time for us to go and take care of this. Well, they apparently don't get it at all. I imagine them sitting in confused silence, followed by Jesus, perhaps rolling his eyes and speaking a little bit more clearly in verse 11 when he says, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." And of course, that's still not plain enough for them. They still don't get it. And we tend to look at these disciples as being rather dense, as if, come on, guys, why do you not understand these things when Jesus says them? And that's not really fair. I wouldn't have done any better in their circumstances, and neither would you. And that realization should help us to be a little bit more humble, not only as we compare ourselves to Jesus' disciples, but a little bit more humble in the present time as well. Thomas's attitude toward this trek is probably somewhat representative of all 12 of them when he says in verse 16, "Let us also go that we may die with him." Why would he say such a thing? It's as if he thinks we're losing. So yes, he's taken what Jesus said about the 12 hours in the day and that the night is coming, and he thinks that the night is coming very soon and that there's not going to be a morning to follow it. Thomas feels despondent. The other 11 probably do as well. There's one more important point for us to hit in this section. Jesus knows, by verse 4, the purpose of what is happening here. He said that this happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And he also said that it was not to lead to death. And yet he also knows that Lazarus has died. I hope this makes it clear by this point, if you didn't realize it already, between his foreknowledge and his statements of purpose and his piddling around, he has deliberately waited for Lazarus to die. Let's pick up again in verse 17. "Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you.' Jesus said to her, 'Your brother will rise again.' Martha said to him, 'I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day.' Jesus said to her, 'I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?' She said to him, 'Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world.'" When John says the Jews, he generally means the religious authorities at Jerusalem, and particularly the Pharisees, but that's not really the case here. This time he's just talking about friends of this family, although some of them do have connections to those authorities. Then we finally meet Martha. Martha comes out and greets Jesus, and we see a great statement of faith from her, and that speaks very well of her. It's actually kind of strange for her to say what she does in verse 22, "Even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." What does that have to do with the issues at hand, Martha? Well, it's because she's trying to assure Jesus that she hasn't lost faith in him. She went out of her way to have him notified that her brother was sick, in an effort to get him to come and heal Lazarus. Well, Jesus didn't do that. And so in a sense, she's disappointed by that. And yet she's saying, I don't blame you, and I still believe in you. And then, of course, Jesus gives her another reply that is something of a riddle, at least from her perspective. She doesn't get it. She says, yes, 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 I know. She seems to think that it's nothing but a reminder that, there is a resurrection coming. So there'll come a day that you get to see him again. And that's all well and good. That's worth saying, but that's not really what Jesus means. What he means is made clear in his I am statement that follows in verse 25. I am the resurrection. So Martha says, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection. And Jesus says, yep, that's me. Wow, that is a very bold, a very aggressive statement of who he is and his purpose. And her reply to him is also somewhat unprecedented in the context of John's gospel. It's the clearest confession that we have seen yet. Let's reread that in verse 27. She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. Let's keep reading. Verse 28. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit, and greatly troubled. And he said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus wept. So the Jews said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? So Mary goes out to meet him, and her greeting is pretty much the same. She also wants to point out to Jesus that she still believes in him. And then we see verse 33, something a bit odd. Why should Jesus be troubled at this time? Everything is going according to plan. Why should he be deeply moved? And the word behind this, by the way, is not talking about purely grief or sadness over a loss. The word behind this in Greek carries an implication of not quite anger, but indignation, frustration. And that's the way that Jesus was feeling about these events. After this, in verse 35, we read that Jesus wept. And the people conclude something by this in verse 36, see how he loved him. Why do you think that John included this? Is it to demonstrate that they were properly understanding what Jesus was doing? Did his disciples get it? Did Thomas get it? Did Martha get it? Did Mary get it? None of them did. Do you really think that this random sampling of the populace was interpreting this properly? No. Jesus is not weeping just out of grief. He's not troubled just because his friend has died. Why would he be devastated at this? He let it happen. He knew that it was going to happen. He planned for this to happen. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that he is being callous and heartless about this. It's not that he's happy that his friend had to go through this horrible experience. There is grief involved. But what has he been trying to do since the beginning of this chapter? He told his disciples, this is not going to lead to death. This is to glorify God and God's Son. He says in verse 11, Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. This has always been the plan. Then he says again in verses 14 and 15, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there. He tells Martha, your brother will rise again. And he doesn't just mean the resurrection of the last day. He's planning. He's going to go raise Lazarus from the dead. So finally, when Mary comes up and she says the same thing, Lord, I haven't lost faith in you, even though you weren't here to save my brother. And when the Jews around them who are mourning along with this family say, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying? They all say the same thing. They all know that Jesus could have prevented this from happening. But not a single one of them has any idea that he can reverse it. Jesus' frustration here is because no one gets it. It's because no one even hopes that he will raise Lazarus. Even his closest friends, even his disciples, even those who believe that he is the Messiah, they don't see who he is fully. They don't understand what he can do. Everyone, his disciples, Martha, Mary, the random crew of mourners, they all say the same thing. As we read in verse 37, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? No one thinks to ask Jesus, can you bring him back? They all think this is final, and that is what is troubling and deeply moving and frustrating to Jesus. Well, let's keep reading. Verse 38. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. As he begins enacting this great drama, the people who are witnessing it must think it a very strange situation. What is he doing? Why in the world would he want the stone roller? Why would he want to go into that tomb? Do you really want to smell that, Jesus? And then you see what happens. The dead man comes out. And what was the stated goal? What did Jesus say in all of their hearing that he's trying to accomplish by doing this? Verse 42, I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. And what's the result of this great miracle? Let's pick up in verse 45. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Okay, so at the beginning of that section, we could have just said, mission accomplished, right? He was trying to bring it about that people would believe in him and believe that the Father sent him, and many of them did believe. But some of them go and tattle on him to the Pharisees. What's the result of their tattling? These are the chief priests and the religious authorities. And are they at all concerned about God's will? No. Are they at all concerned about Jesus' origin and whether or not it is heavenly? No, doesn't come up. Are they even at all concerned about what is the truth? They are concerned with results. They're not concerned with furthering God's design. They're concerned with their own status and maintaining or elevating that status. And so, regardless of Jesus' origin, regardless of what God wants, they immediately seek to undermine him. They don't stop and say, really? How did this come about? Can we see this man who you say was dead? Instead, we have in the latter part of verse 47, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. Well, at least there is one nice thing thrown in here. Caiaphas has an accidental prophecy, which serves to show the power of God, that God can even use a horrible, rotten human being like this, who is literally out to kill his son, and prophesy through him. It also shows the moral emptiness of the religious authorities at that time. He's even scornful toward his own side. His own side, they're saying, what are we to do? They agree with him. They say, we need to put a stop to what this man is doing because we're going to lose our place. And he says, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better, etc., etc. He's mocking and scornful toward them. Why? Because they're not leaping as quickly as he has to the conclusion that they ought to murder this man. He clearly doesn't care about keeping the commandments of the God that he claims to serve. Let's pick up in verse 54 and read through the end of the chapter. Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus, and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, what do you think, that he will not come to the feast at all? Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know, so that they might arrest him. A number of times as we have gone through this book together, I have compared it to the way that we would display it in something like a movie, and I'm going to do that again here. This is sort of like the end of the first act. Most of the loose ends are tied off. John's summarization of the current situation shows that we're closing one chapter and we're about to open another one. We've also covered Jesus' status, sort of where he stands as far as the religious authorities. We know that they're ready to arrest him, and they say, if anyone sees him, let us know where. We're also seeing his habits, so we're establishing more and more of the setting and his character. His habit now is to basically stay hidden because, well, it's not yet time for him to be executed, although it's getting close. And there's also a lot of strong foreshadowing of what is to come in the next act. Chapter 12 will begin the second act of this drama. The rest of what follows is tied very tightly together in a short amount of time. By now, it's as if the case has been made. All of the details that you need to know have been put right in front of you. You've had the opportunity to see the relationships between the main characters and to see where this story is leading. And now it's not so much a question of what's going to happen, but of how it's going to happen and why and what will come of it in the end. By now, Jesus has demonstrated very clearly who he is. He's demonstrated what he can do. And he's demonstrated what he intends and what he promises. And he's also made it very clear what all that means for us. He has shown us his humanity in this chapter. We saw him expressing grief and also indignation and frustration. He's also shown us his divinity in the fact that he clearly has control of the situation from beginning to end, in the way that he calculates each successive move. Obviously, the power that he displays in raising this dead man back to life shows his divinity, and the fact that he commands the most powerful force of evil that exists, death itself, to give up one of its victims. And yet, he keeps promising more. That's really the point of this whole demonstration. It's so that those who saw it would believe that he came from heaven and was sent by the Father and had authority over all things in this world. It was to back up the promises that he had made. He tells people all the time in this book, as we have seen as we've gone through it so far, that his followers will be given eternal life, that his disciples don't have to submit to death. Now, he's stating very clearly, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Well, that is a thoroughly absurd claim to make because, well, death comes to us all eventually. On its face, it's an unbelievable thing to say, and yet he says it. And then he gives a small demonstration by giving a dead man his life back. That's not in a metaphorical sense. It's not in a purely spiritual way that would lead some people to deny that it was real or deny it was meaningful. He let his friend die of an illness and then let him lie in a grave long enough that no one could say, he was just in a coma and then woke up. He was dead. He'd been dead for 4 days. His earthly remains should have been the fuel for a whole new ecosystem of scavengers and microorganisms as his body slowly decomposed in a hideous, sickening display of quiet destruction and defilement, complete with the lingering stench of rotting flesh. Instead, he got up and left his grave because Jesus told him to. Even death obeys Jesus and relinquishes its power over his friend. So what about you? Do you believe? That's the question that Jesus keeps asking. Do you believe? Do you obey? When you eventually die, as you will one day unless Jesus returns before then, what outcome awaits you? Lazarus was given back his mortal life, but that wasn't eternal. He would eventually die again, as everyone understood. Spoiler, in the next chapter, Jesus' enemies are going to start plotting to kill Lazarus. They realize that that's still possible. Jesus is promising you an enduring life, one that you'll never have to give up, but only if you believe in him. What does it mean to believe? Does it mean mouth the right words and then go on about your life? I've seen a lot of that approach, but no, that's not what it means. We can tell by people's actions whether they truly believe. Those who don't believe are the liars, the plotters, the murderers, the cynics, who only care about their own lives and their own power and status. They haven't submitted to God or to the one God sent to save them. Are you any different? I certainly hope so. I hope you're not the type of person who wants to silence Jesus, who wants to get rid of him, who wants to shut him up, who wants to keep him underground and kill him if you have to, in order to avoid acknowledging him as king. I hope that instead you're the type of person to seek him out, to listen to his teaching, and to do what he says. That's the way to enter into his kingdom. That's the way to find forgiveness for your sins. That's the way to receive his gift of life. If you need to learn more, if you need help moving forward with that, if you want to become a part of Christ's kingdom, we would love to help. You can reach out to us at the River Ridge Church of Christ by phone. You can reach us at 812-550-6234. You can reach us over email at info@riverridgechurch.org. You can reach us over Facebook. You can visit us at 5600 Vann Road next Sunday morning at 10 a.m. And you can also keep watching. We are past the halfway point in John's Gospel, and I am looking forward to getting into the second act. Jesus speaks even more clearly, and he shows more and more of who he is, culminating finally with his own death and resurrection. So please join me again on Iron Sharpens Iron.